Well, howdy everyone, and having a bit of spare time recently, I couldn't resist taking a look at quite a rare and potentially interesting lens, which not many people have heard of, the Tokina 50-135mm f2.8. It's discontinued now, but with a bit of luck you can still find them over on eBay. I found mine for £275 or about $400, which seems pretty good value for a fast telephoto zoom lens. Tokina introduced this lens to the market at Tokina back in 2006, so it's getting on a bit now. It's been specially designed for APS-C digital cameras, so it won't work properly if you're using a more expensive full-frame digital SLR. And I love the whole concept behind this lens. The extremely useful focal range of 50-135mm is intended to mimic a 70-200mm lens when used on a full-frame camera, although it actually works out to be the equivalent of 80-216mm on a Canon camera. 50mm is certainly much wider than 70, so that makes this lens a lot more suited to general purpose use than a lens that starts at 70mm. The wide f2.8 maximum aperture makes this a fast telephoto zoom lens. It lets in lots of light for a telephoto lens, making it potentially suitable for shooting sports, low light work and indoors photography. It's also very good for portrait work, potentially giving you very nice out of focus backgrounds. The other advantage of this lens is that, because it's designed for cameras with a smaller APS-C sensor, it can be a lot smaller than a normal f2.8 telephoto zoom lens. I mean, here's one of Canon's 70-200mm f2.8 lenses. As you can see, compared to the Tokina lens, it's enormous, not to mention being considerably heavier. The Tokina lens, however, will fit quite easily into a normal sized camera bag. This could be a useful lens for video work with its fast and constant maximum aperture. However, unfortunately, it's a bit too old to have image stabilization, as you can see here, so you'll really want to use a tripod. Let's take a look at build quality. As always with a Tokina lens, it's very solidly built and quite weighty. It has a useful tripod mount which doesn't come off the lens at all. The lens comes with a very deep lens hood which is useful and nicely flocked on the inside. The lens's zoom ring works smoothly but not perfectly evenly, but the lens zooms internally, which is a nice touch. The large focus ring turns fairly smoothly and is just precise enough for accurate manual focusing. Push the ring forward to switch the lens to autofocus, and the ring is safely decoupled from the focus motor. The front element of the lens does not extend or rotate. The autofocus on this lens is pretty old school. It's a bit slow and pretty noisy. You're also treated to a mighty clump when it reaches either end of its focus path, which is pretty attention grabbing. The tested autofocus accuracy of this lens was poor. It seemed to miss focus about 15% of the time. Overall, the lens is built very nicely indeed, but the whole focus system is a bit old hat, not to mention noisy and unreliable. Well, let's move on and look at image quality. A few years ago this lens had a good reputation for being fairly sharp, but that was in the days of 8 and 12 megapixel cameras. Let's see how it presents itself on a modern 20 megapixel camera, in this case my new Canon 70D. Let's start at 50mm and f2.8. With this wide open aperture, the middle of the picture is acceptably sharp, but not impressive by any means. Contrast levels are also a tiny bit weak. In the corners we see just a tiny reduction in sharpness. We also get some moderately strong blue and magenta chromatic aberration, clearly visible here in the window panes. Stop the lens down to f4 and the picture is moderately sharper and the chromatic aberration slightly tamed. There are further slight improvements at f5.6 and f8. Back in the middle of the picture, the image looks great. So at 50mm it's a slightly mediocre showing at f2.8, but stop the lens down a little and you get good results. Let's zoom in halfway to 85mm. At f2.8, the centre of the picture is acceptably sharp again, but not impressive. The corners of the image are slightly soft, but thankfully I can no longer bear witness to any chromatic aberration. Stopped down to f4, those corners are definitely sharper and brighter. Stop down to f5.6 for great image quality, and things are fantastic at f8. The quality in the middle of the image is also great to see. So again, the lens is struggling a bit at f2.8, but stop down the aperture for some very good image quality. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 135mm. Unfortunately, the middle of the image is noticeably soft with quite poor levels of contrast. This picture is focused correctly, and it's the best picture quality I could get out of the lens. Quite a shame really, and the corners of the image are doing slightly worse. We also see some very noticeable green and purple chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. Stop the lens down, and the image gets a little sharper and brighter in the corners, and back in the middle of the frame, the image quality is much better overall. Stop the lens down to f5.6 for great image quality in the middle, although the corners are still, well, let's call it colourful. You need to stop the lens down all the way to f11 in order to get sharp corners, but the chromatic aberration still doesn't go away. So it's quite a weak performance at 135mm really, apart from the middle of the image once you stop the lens down. Overall, this 8-year-old lens may have been sharp enough for older, lower resolution digital cameras, but it struggles to keep its head above water on the challenging 20-megapixel sensor of the Canon 70D. It's just a bit soft really, bit of a shame. Moving on, let's look at distortion and vignetting. At 50mm there's a very tiny amount of barrel distortion and very slight darkness in the corners, but nothing to really worry about. The distortion straightens out at 70mm, and zoom into 135mm and we see some noticeable pincushion distortion, but I've definitely seen worse. Again, the corners don't look too dark, which is good for an f2.8 aperture. It's a fairly good show overall for vignetting and distortion. The lens can focus as close as 1 meter from your subject, which isn't very close really. That close-up picture quality at f2.8 is very poor indeed, being very soft with low contrast levels. At f4 it's rather better, and better again at f5.6, and finally at f8 we can get some sharp pictures close up. A pretty weak show though, really. The lens has some weird and pretty major issues when it comes to working against bright light. As you can see here, there's abundant flaring and ghosting. Interestingly, if you look carefully here, you can see an actual reflection of the image that's reaching the lens. Here's the footage in slow motion. I noticed this effect a couple of other times when shooting against bright light sources, and I've never seen it so clearly on any other camera lens. I think it's happening because the front element of the 50 to 135 specifically has a special and peculiar waterproof coating. Maybe you can see the unusual glaring white reflection it causes right here. Tokina never used this kind of coating again after this lens, so my guess is that this is what's causing such a crazy problem. Well, you see something new every day. This f2.8 lens can give you some nice out-of-focus backgrounds. The quality of the lens's bokeh is reasonably nice and unobtrusive, but it can look just a little bit smudgy sometimes. So overall, I really wanted to love this camera lens because the concept behind it is so handy. It's got a useful zoom range, a fast maximum aperture, it's relatively small and it's built very solidly, but there are just too many question marks about its image quality and its dated autofocus system. It basically needs a modern update. If you're interested in this kind of lens but you want something a bit more capable, then Sigma makes something similar, their 50 to 150mm f2.8 OS lens. Compared to the Tokina, it's pretty huge and expensive, but it's also meant to have fantastic image quality, as well as optical stabilization. I might review it one day. I was a bit disappointed with this Tokina lens though, so all I would say is that if you can find it on eBay, then it's simply one option for you, if you want an inexpensive, fast aperture telephoto zoom lens.